this computer. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast today. I'm really excited today to have on Sara Salyers. She is at least a co-founder of SALVO, I believe.
Founder, yeah.
Founder of SALVO, award-winning journalist, retired TV producer. But I'll leave the brief introduction up to yourself, and then we can get started if that's okay.
Well, actually, probably truthfully, Salvo came about because of something that I think probably because of my background, which was that I was married to a Cherokee and had become familiar with treaty law. I had begun looking at Scotland's relationship with England in a different way, and from that perspective. And the first thing that struck me was that this was a treaty, as Professor Walker makes very clear, that this was clearly an international treaty between two sovereign states. And whatever happened thereafter, that is the founding basis for the state that calls itself the United Kingdom. And it seemed to me that either the United Kingdom was not actually there, or the people of Scotland had the provisions in the Claim of Right, because that was a precondition. So on that basis, I spoke to my colleagues I was attending SSRG meetings regularly at that point. And I said, if you don't mind, I'm going to put my energies into focusing on this. And so myself and Alf Baird and Brian Allen and Laurie Flynn, and one other who asked not to be mentioned in relation with that, so I'm not mentioning him, peeled off, and we launched Salvo, and that was in 2022, and we had our formal launch and at I think it's called the Dobby Centre in just outside Falkirk, or just outside Falkirk. And we've been growing since then, and in the September of that year, again, thanks to discussions within the SSRG, which was invaluable actually for building up to starting this whole campaign. There were just amazing opportunities for people to meet and talk things out. And there was an American professor of international law that was attending seminars at that weekly meetings at that point, by the name of Dr. Paul McCartney, of an unforgettable name. And we used to have very robust discussions, let's put it that way. And on one occasion, we'd go back and forward. And I said, well, in that case, because I was looking at this whole international aspect, which obviously over time has become clearly the most important thing we need to address. And I said, well, then, how do we do this? I mean, how do we obtain a platform to address the international community and explain that we're not actually in the union we're supposed to be in, that we're kind of hog-tied here. And he said, well, you could always start a liberation movement. So we did. And the rest, is history. And then
what can you do?
And what we've been doing is unpicking and uncovering both Scotland's real history, because you can't understand your present unless you understand how you got there. It's a bit like finding out who your parents are, and how did they come to live in this part of the world, and where are your relatives. It's really very similar to that. You don't understand what you are, and we're supposed to be, the United Kingdom is supposed to be the child of a union between England and Scotland. So you have to understand that to understand what your real status is. And it matters very much for reasons we can talk about. And in the process, we have discovered that the history that is taught in schools and universities and venerated as the orthodoxy, the word is it's bunk. We're not taught anything about our real history and how we were brought into this union, and what happened when in 1707, when the treaty was supposedly brought into, it came into effect, was ratified, and everything it said was to happen was supposed to have happened. So as time has gone on, we have come to this point where we can say categorically, guys, we've been spinning wheels here, wasting time going in circles, because there's no union. There's no, the United Kingdom has never come into existence. This is just England. And what it did, in fact, was put the treaty in the bin, as it did with so many nations that it planned to colonize. And let me tell you, the idea of colonizing, that is the word, Scotland, was mooted by Henry VIII, using, Scotland needs to be a colony of England. And that's when he proposed marrying his son Edward to Mary Queen of Scots. And when that was refused, that was followed by what they call the rough wooing. Well, let me tell you, the rough wooing was an invasion of Scotland, with the following which there was it's estimated that around 10,000 Scots were killed, because he had planned to make Scotland a colony of England and failed at that point. And so it isn't surprising when you trace it all the way back, it isn't at all surprising that this treaty turns out to have been a pretext by which England would colonize Scotland. And then when the decolonization process began at the United Nations, the British state, which is just the English state, came up with a story, a narrative, produced a report, which is a beautiful work of fiction about the thriving of Scotland as a partner in this union. And that famous phrase that we've heard so many times, Scotland is a nation and entered the union with England as a voluntary partner and not as a dependency. Very interesting. In 1952, absolutely nobody at home was asking whether Scotland was a dependency. It's another word for colony. That was produced, and I checked that this is correct. That was produced for the international community, and I got that confirmed by a retired Supreme Court judge. It was produced for the international community, and the Scots bought it, and our politicians have bought it. And as a result, we've been going around in circles ever since. So, and what we're doing now, of course, as a result, is that Liberation Scotland, the Liberation Committee, is taking this fight to the international community as a liberation movement. We have made sure that we meet all of those criteria. We are a genuine grassroots liberation movement. At home, SALVO carries on the campaign that every liberation movement has to have, the campaign that says these are our rights. Those are the constitutional rights of the people of Scotland, the rights of a colonized people who are seeing their assets and their resources taken and taken away down to the metropolitan, down to the mother country, seeing themselves having to buy back their own energy at higher prices, seeing everything going for the benefit of the colonizer. Scotland stripped bare, sucked dry, and her people, without jobs, without industry, without infrastructure, without investment, without hope, and with rising levels of poverty. This is the wretched condition of a colonized country. And that's what SALVO is now fighting. We're not, obviously, interested in any kind of violence. We're a peaceful movement, but we need to challenge and challenge and challenge what is being done to Scotland, which is unlawful in international law and clearly an assault on the welfare and completely unlawful, by the way, under any treaty of union if it had been in place. So, I'm really proud of the members of SALVO
who
began the Free Ports campaign and got together with
Colette Walker and stuff. Yeah.
And are now really, thanks to those people who have worked tirelessly, they have made sure that people in Scotland are beginning to understand what these things mean, that these soothing, comforting words say, oh, they're not the same as in England, etc., etc. They're not. They're just fiction. They're just not. They're there in the same way that we were told how great privatization would be.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just a new manifestation of trade deals and hollowing out areas and taking out the riches and giving the profits to the usual suspects. It's the usual MO.
It's privatization on steroids with private companies being being in charge of things that normally, would be difficult enough to make sure that government was doing, make sure the laws are followed. But now you've got private companies whose only interest is profit. And all these health assurances. So we need to challenge that. But what makes it distinct is that because this is a SALVO campaign, we will be challenging on the basis of the fact that the owners of Scotland remain the people of Scotland, and that what is being done is unlawful under the Scottish Constitution, under the claim of right, under the terms of the Treaty of Union, under international law. And it has never been challenged. So, keep your eye open. We built in 3 years, not quite 3 years, actually. We're a couple of months away from the anniversary of launching SALVO, to a point where we can now look at a proper legal challenge, and that will have to come.
I think it's great work. I mean, to me, it seems. I mean, when all the evidence is, when you see all the evidence that SALVO I've researched and looked into, and even Westminster say can't deny these things. So to me, once again, it strikes me as like, here are some facts that are not really well known, certainly not known well enough, and they certainly don't seem to have any effect in the real world. It's almost like facts now just have there's more meaning behind the facts than actual reality. And so, like all this hard work that, SALVO has been doing, and many other, organizations with various other endeavors, but specifically SALVO with all the technical and academic work and research that they have to do. It must be kind of strange to, like you say, when you mentioned about 300 years ago or 250 years ago, that probably most of the population knew exactly what was going on, and they could, at least to some degree, that would affect in their lives. As when now it's, SALVO, although it's, it's well known, it's nationally known, and now internationally known, I suspect it's not at the place where it needs to be. It's like I said, people need to understand the facts of what it is. So can I just say, I'd love to just read a quote from an article that you wrote a little while back, just so we can talk about the modern, and then maybe go back and bring the past into context again. So you wrote a piece it's called All That's Wrong, and I'll just read your first paragraph from it, just so I can get you started, if that's all right. Okay, I'm quoting. At the heart of the political and social disaster unfolding around us is a broken political system. Anglo-Norman feudalism in modern clothing has given us a despotic and unaccountable government. Political corruption, cronyism, incompetence, privilege with impunity for a powerful, wealthy elite, and government violation of the rule of law and government betrayal of the public trust. Under this despotic system, we the people have no guarantee whatsoever of our public right, interests, or needs, or even those that are enshrined in law, and we have no mechanism for redress. That is why we can fairly describe this supposed democracy as despotism. We may vote for a different party every 5 years, but this is no more than a different flavor of the same poison, which is, before you answer, I'm just going to put in this funny bit, because I was aware of this joke that an American comedian mentioned many, many years ago, George Carlin, you might have heard of him. And I remember he said, and he was talking about this thing, and he said, we basically have the choice between a shit sandwich or shit on toast. And, that's the crass way of putting it. Anyway, would you care to explain that? Because I think you're giving a flavour, and you mentioned it earlier. I was listening to Naomi Klein just the other day. I was reading a piece of her and some other people, and just talking about, they were speaking to folk, and it's no surprise that a lot of young folk in America, they don't seem to have any hope for the future. Not as much as previous generations were. So, would you be able to give us your sort of feeling of the flavour of the modern sort of discourse?
Well, I think what I was writing about is that nobody has a solution for this. We can, the first thing to be able to do is to describe what you're seeing. That sounds so obvious that you shouldn't need to say it. I mean, what do you mean? You've got to be able to describe. Of course you could, but actually, that's more difficult than you might think. Take another look, and are you sure that you're accurately describing this crime that you're seeing or this situation? Because, and think of it like diagnosis, there are many diseases that look the same. But if you get the diagnosis wrong, you're not going to prescribe the correct medicine.
It could make it worse.
Yeah. Kill the patient. You need to know what you're looking at. You need to be able to diagnose from these symptoms what the disease is. And you need to be able to therefore prescribe a medicine that will restore the patient. So we're looking at Scotland's situation, and actually, it is the situation of a colony. Once you start to understand what a colony really is, not the cliche stuff that we, the extreme, the worst that we hear about, but technically what makes something a colony, and what do all colonies have in common. Then you begin to understand what you're looking at. What you're looking at is a state that is up to its eyeballs in a history of, and colonization is racist and classist, if you like. It assumes the right, and it's a right based on superiority. Winston Churchill famously talked about how he did not believe that the civilized Europeans who displaced and destroyed so many indigenous people were committing a crime, because they were civilized. They had a right to this land and to expand civilization. And it's a sort of dog in the manger thing that these people who were worthless, subhuman in his view.
Yeah, there's a term for it, isn't there? They literally walked onto people's lands and they said, "Oh, these are savages, so we've got the right to take over the land." I can't remember, it was a Latin term.
Eminent domain, I think. But anyway, it was this notion. It's a eugenic notion. By the way, eugenics has never gone anywhere. So that you look and see what you're seeing. In order to see that, once you see that, then you put what we are seeing in terms of it's now gone insane. This colonizing mentality, which is very closely tied to profit. You want to absolutely, what would you call an archetypal image of what we're talking about. Look at what are called the Opium Wars.
Mm-hmm.
If you read about those, you will want to be sick. It was absolutely horrific. And of course, while China didn't become part of the British Empire, parts of its territory did. And what was done there in order to ensure the profits of the East India Company is something that should have haunted the inhabitants of these islands in the same way that the Holocaust haunts Germany.
Mm-hmm. Millions of opium addicts.
And the horror of what was done. So this is colonialism. It has a right to do what it does. It is inhuman. But it comes out of, I called it, it's feudal in nature. It's essentially feudal. And feudalism at its heart is the notion of a kind of a pyramid, which is held up on the bottom by those without worth, except that their entire purpose in life is to hold the pyramid up. And that's generally kind of you and me. And you have little sliding scales up that, you can call it working class, middle class if you want, but it's a system of privilege. And so that under this system, you end up with one person at the top, the monarch, who is, or a tiny little group, and that tiny little group can never be put on trial. Cannot be charged under our laws, if you like, or the laws that they preside over. They're immune, and that privilege is slightly less as you go down, and so that you can look at that and say, so the law is actually there to control the masses. And what holds it in place is a sort of, or had held it in place so that people felt it was a pretty good thing, really, is a sort of an honor system, so that in the past, somebody who was found, committing fraud or even cheating on their wife or whatever, resigned from public life. That's no longer the case. The corruption now is is open. The entitlement of those at the top is open. The problem is not that the system of honor has left the political system. And this is in the UK, this is in America too, and seeing it around the world. It's that the system exists at all. So I'm talking about, describing what I'm seeing, but I'm talking about the remedy. And Scotland had a very different political system. Now, that's not what you've learned in your histories. It's not what you've been told. It's not what the politicians learned at university and talked about at rallies. You know, we need to leave Scotland's feudal history behind. Scotland had the same, you know, Scots had no lawyers. Actually, we had the first legal aid that anybody knows of in the world. The poor man's law, and I forget the date, but it was either late 1300s or early 1400s.
Wow.
Prescribed that out of the common good funds, and there you are, common good. That's the bit we all own. The second bit we all own, actually. But out of the common good funds, anyone who didn't have the money for a lawyer was to be, and had a case and the need for justice, had to be given the funds to hire a good and able lawyer to either to defend them or to present their case. That's legal aid. And you're talking about legal aid 600 years ago under Scots. And it's part of the constitutional setup in Scotland because it has to do with the rights of the people as sovereign. So you cannot deny a Scot the right to law. Well, they have already gone and done that. They've taken legal aid away. In Scots law, permitted. So we have in Scots law, a king or a queen could be put on trial because they're equal in law. The people are sovereign. That's because the people are the crown in Scotland. And that all sounds very, very romantic and what's the word? You know, airy-fairy and whatever. It's not. It's extraordinarily practical. It was extraordinarily practical. And it was understood. You know, it wasn't a golden thread that sort of tipped through history. It was a very, very practical, a real thing. Scots were entitled to legal aid and they got it. And they tended to know the law. They were entitled to challenge their parliament if it did anything that contravened their civil rights. That was SALVO. And they could refer the parliament to the Court of Session or the Court of Session to the parliament. There were 3 vehicles to do that. So we had 3 parliaments. That's where, by the way, the separation of powers came from Scotland.
Yeah.
We invented it. And we had these 3 parliaments, the one that met on a regular basis, which we think of as the executive parliament. Then you had the Convention of States and the Royal Convention of the Boroughs. And they all worked together. And they worked in a way that meant that we had a form of participatory democracy before that term had ever been invented. Now that puts a block on untrammeled power. It holds, and it's there in the Claim of Right. You know, we were taught that the Claim of Right was this religious document, and that all that mattered about it was the religious stuff that had been put there by, William the Psycho Orange. But it wasn't. What he gave them was taken and turned into a document that preserved the Scottish Constitution. He had to swear to uphold it, or not be. And thereafter, any lawful king or queen of Scots had to swear to uphold the Claim of Right in full. You'll notice that Charles III of England swore to a cobbled together numpty nonsense, swearing to uphold the Presbyterian Church as it is protected under the Claim of Right. That's not the Claim of Right. It's nothing to do with it. That's swearing to uphold the Presbyterian Church, not the Claim of Right in total. Claim of Right in total was this constitutional document, so that Daniel Defoe, the English spy and pro-unionist and journalist, wrote of the Claim of Right that the provisions as to government and obedience, that means a constitution, will remain in force in Scotland as under the Claim of Right. So it was well understood what the Claim of Right did. And that sets the people. The people are the crown. The monarch wears the crown, but the people are the crown. And so the Crown of Scotland can't go away as long as there's a Scots people. Something the English didn't understand. If they don't take the oath, then the Scots crown goes away. But they've discovered it didn't, and they have to administer the crown. The crown is the people. The crown owns everything. It owns the land. So you can stop talking about nationalization because the people own the lot. They own the land. And beyond that, those people who, that crown, via the monarch, can say to certain areas, these are yours. There'll be no taxes here. You'll own this. They'll be entirely for the people and the good of the people without any taxation. And that's what we call common good property, which is all across Scotland. You have this extraordinary ability of the people to recall, we call it, they sacked a government under the Claim of Right in 1689, under their right as a sovereign people. Interesting, Craig Murray posted today, because he's researching for a paper he's writing, that James VIII, or who would have been James VIII of Scotland, noted that the union was a fake, it was a pretense, because in Scotland the people are sovereign, and they had objected strenuously and clearly to it. So it was well understood, people are sovereign, practically. This is not legal. Parliament isn't finished in Scotland until SALVO is called, giving the people the chance to challenge what has just been passed and say, no, you can't pass that. Refer it to the court. And if it's violating their rights, it's stopped. Sovereignty, the closest thing we can see to it, and it's not quite the same, is direct democracy. But it is an extraordinary set of levers and mechanisms that the people have in law. Even if those were blocked or not used as much as they might have been, although they were used a damn sight more often than we didn't even know they existed, let alone that they were used. So we have this ancient blueprint that was there. It was there 300 years ago. Now, look at what's wrong. Look at what we've done, all that's wrong. Now imagine Scotland has been colonized. That is the equivalent of someone's boot on your windpipe. You lift the boot. You don't invent a new country. The person sits up and you bring them back. You bring them back to life. In Scotland's case, bringing us back to life doesn't mean going back to somebody running through the heather, painted in wool and shouting freedom. It means we look at the Scottish separation of powers, how we inspired the whole world with that, and it spread across the world, and we consider how we bring that back in a modern context. Because you're now beginning to challenge this focused power in the hands of a feudal minority at the top of the pyramid. You're returning that power, you're turning that pyramid on its head, you're returning that power to its real base, its power base. You're then looking at SALVO. Right, that needs to come back. We need to have that mechanism by which that the parliamentary session is not finished until someone says, hang on a minute, you've just cut across the right to protest. You're not allowed to do that. You're not privileged and entitled above the law to do that. Privilege, by the way, just means private law, privé law. You're not entitled. No, refer to the court. We need to clean up the courts, but we have mechanisms for that too, under the claim of right. Absolutely clear ones. As you begin to restore Scotland's ancient constitutional mechanisms, you begin to provide a prescription, a remedy for the whole world, so that we begin by restoring our constitution in a modern context, so that we have these intrinsically Scottish, wonderful Scottish provisions. And there is not only our contribution to ourselves, our healing, our restoration, instead of, all these people inventing, we can have this kind of constitution. Oh, why don't we have that? Why don't we look at this country? Why don't we look at Scotland, recognize that we were a state with a long developed constitution, and begin by saying, as Scots, we need to take what made us is distinctly Scottish, the first country in the world to have legal aid, the first country I know of in the world to have environmental laws that were part of what they called the laudable or lovable laws, the first country that I know of in Europe that had a form of participatory democracy. I may be wrong. I'm not enough of a scholar to make that absolute claim, but certainly distinctly Scottish, distinctly ours, something that no matter what our form of Scots we speak, or Gaelic, or no matter what part of Scotland we come from, no matter what our background, we can say, here's our constitution. These old provisions are radical and modernized. They're essentially ours. They're really uniquely Scottish, but they have this ability, again, to inspire the whole world and to provide a remedy, I think, for what we're seeing right across the world. So that's what lay behind that particular article. That, you know, we invented the trade embassy, we invented the separation of powers, we invented legal aid. The common good was the Scots and Irish, I have to say, prior to the English, but a Celtic but very Scottish notion, and the sovereignty of the people. We had long before Switzerland had direct democracy, where their representatives refer to the people as the sovereign. So, you know, we wouldn't be the first country to do this, but we would be the country coming back to really putting that into practice in a way we probably, you know, we didn't absolutely in the way that Switzerland does, you know, where you have these referendums and so on and so forth. But we had it in practice. We had it there as the basis of the Scottish Constitution from the time of Kenneth MacAlpin, from the 9th century. So we need a lot more than just to say we're going to allow our elected, privileged, entitled, unaccountable representatives to operate without any interference by Westminster. If that is all that independence is, it's not worth having. You know, Bruno Kaufmann, who came to talk to us about direct democracy a year and a half back, said to me, you know, there's no country, no nation is independent until its people are independent.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just like you say about participatory democracy. You know, I speak to some people, and some people have the view, let's not talk about these things or policy or what everybody's doing. Let's all just club together and get independence, and then we can get on with the task in hand. But there's also the people where, well, they say, well, you have to have some kind of vision to get the people interested. Do you know what I mean? So to me, when I look at the salvo and stuff, I don't just look upon it as a reclamation of historical fact and where we are and what we're entitled to. I actually do look upon it as a vision, because I think in the modern context, any kind of participatory democracy, like you say, you know, whether it be the Scottish National Congress that has influence on legislature, and have that participatory democracy, that is a revelation. And even though maybe Scotland is not once as well known, or the influence it might have had years ago in the past, it's still a big Western European country with a lot of history, and if you could get independence through this method, it could literally light a fire, in the Western world to some degree. I would imagine. In some respect, I'd have to say, in my idealistic moments, I do wish for something like that, and I do wish that it could happen. So this is why I want it to be, your endeavours to be such a success. Can I just bring it up to the modern again? I've read somewhere that you was talking about, our elected representatives. They tend to ignore the fact, or be ignorant of the fact that they're not our representatives. Just because we elect them doesn't mean that they have our sovereignty. Can you explain that in the modern context? How is it that we, as the Scottish people, say, as an example, like we have done in the UK, just followed that model where we put an X on a box, like you say, every few years, and we literally defer our sovereignty? Is what is so sorry. What I'm trying to get at is party politics is a problem. Once again, Salvo I see is 100% grassroots. It's like a thing I'm invested in is the Indie app. I like that because it's 100% grassroots. Anybody can join it. It's like that, and it has platforms and stuff. So I'm very interested in that grassroots and in that participatory sort of aspect of it and stuff. Would you be able to speak about maybe what is the problem, say, with modern Scottish party politics, and finding mechanisms or establishing legal facts so that we can move on with a constitutional issue?
Look, the big problem is that we have an English political system, which has been shoved on us. I could run through the things that were supposed to be preserved under the Union and within the United Kingdom that's supposed to exist, and show you that none of them were. We've had everything that pertained to Scotland has been replaced by something English. I mean, we say that we still have Scots law. Well, we do, but it's sort of skeletal. Nonetheless, the claim of right is still the basis of Scots common law. But otherwise, we've lost the boroughs, and we had a whole slew of Scottish acts, parliamentary acts, including the Act of Salvo, removed by Westminster, and then they didn't say which ones had been removed, and we didn't have those records to be able to find out. So that's come up, that has been a slow process, finding out what did they take away, and with no authorization to do that at all, except a very wide interpretation of the thing that says the laws may be made the same. But that works both ways. And the reason for this is that, of course, the treaty was never brought into effect. Scotland was annexed. It was later called something else. And so what has happened is that we have had English particularly political law imposed, constitutional law. And we've ended up with, Alf Baird is the one that can speak most eloquently to this, that what you then have is a colonized mindset. And there's so many wonderful writers about, on post-colonial theory, how the colonized become separated from their own identity. And it's very interesting in Scotland to find, if you push very gently, you'll find that the establishment figures, all the ones we're familiar with, will recoil in anger at the notion of a Scottish identity. That's one of the primary symptoms of the disease of a colonized mind. There's nobody in the world, there's no nation in the world, certainly not any liberated or free nation or uncolonized, that is not proud of things about its history. To be a Frenchman, to sing the Marseillaise, Bastille Day, the French thing.
It is strange. It is, like you said, I mean, you're speaking aspects of the colonized mind and how they manifest themselves. It's really ultra interesting.
The national dress, there's no country, there's no, and even our national dress isn't genuine. The wee kilt anyway. And our Highland dancing was introduced. It was the ballet choreographer, French choreographer, came in to teach the Highlanders to adapt their dance so that you looked
yes.
ballet. Real Scots dancing looked like river dancing.
Yeah.
With nothing, and nothing to be proud of, and we have been sold the barbaric noble warrior of the past, Mel Gibson, blah blah, and then taught to be ashamed of that, but it never existed. The Wallace spoke 7 languages. He was the ambassador to what was then the UN, to Rome, from the Bishop of St. Andrews. He was a tactician and a successful merchant. He wasn't this. He didn't live. So
you can't sell that as an entertainment package, I suppose.
But the thing is, you're sold. You're like the Native Americans, like everyone else. You're sold primitive, backward, and then the people come along who romanticize the primitive, and then the urbane and civilized are embarrassed by the romantic primitive and the Braveheart thing.
And you live in the past and all that kind of rhetoric.
One side cringes, the other side paints their faces blue.
Yeah.
And the other side realizes that it's a crock. It's absolute rubbish, and nothing to do with who you are. So this is this psyche, and it means that. So, for instance, you can those who want to get on and collaborate with and cooperate with the colonizing power look to become members of the club.
Yeah.
And their families, like the families of Rishi Sunak and Priti Patel and all these others, they leave when liberation comes. They tend to leave because their situation is not going to be great in the colonies. But still, you look at India, for instance, their civil service, their administration. You know, I keep telling people I was there 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and I was horrified, really horrified by the deference that I was shown because I had white skin. No other reason. And I mean, these are lovely, warm people. They're kind, they're generous, they're wonderful people. But I was aware that I was, you know, in a superior because I was white.
Like that's like a colonized mind once again, I
That is the
suppose.
colonized mind. It was absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah,
Those,
I can imagine.
those at the top, having been colonized for 200 years, were still aiming to send their sons to Eton and Harrow and Rugby and on to Oxford and Cambridge. They're still looking for entry into the club. You know, as you know, Fanon wrote, you know, white mask, blackface, white mask, wanting to be. And the same in America, the Native Americans talk about apples. They mean the same thing. They mean the red on the outside, white on the in.
I suppose if we're talking about hope again, you know, the parents then were probably just thinking, well, you know, that's a hope for the future to follow where we are, and there's no hope in the past, as it were.
You've got it. So that has been so internalized, becomes so internalized that you say to someone about Scottish identity, and they immediately think of all this embarrassing stuff and all the lies we've been told, and they push back really hard. One, former politician said at a meeting recently, I'm not going around the doors, chapping on the doors and saying to people, I want you to be a Scot like me. And it's, whoever, that is the push. That's the colonized mind. This absolute, you push the sore spot and it absolutely reacts. And so what those people want is a clean slate. Let's invent a new Scotland. Let's leave all that behind. We don't want to look at that embarrassing, horrible past. And actually what happens is they need to be healed of that. Absolute disease that has taken place like a cancer in their political thinking. Every country has things it should be ashamed of, things it should say, well, let's learn from that lesson and never do that again. I believe that when we're liberated, we need to look at the individual Scots because they were individual Scots. There was no United Kingdom for them to be partner in, but there were individual Scots who were complicit and benefited from the slave trade. I think we need to look at compensation on behalf of those individuals.
Acknowledgement,
Scotland as a state was dormant at that point. It still existed, but dormant. The Scottish Crown still existed, but dormant. All the decisions, the driving of that ship was English. That was England under another title. We were simply annexed, but we still had Scots who benefited and who profited. And I think that we should own that, but not as a nation, because we were not permitted to operate as a state, making international agreements and so on. We have things we should be proud of. We should be proud of our education system that, and I wonder if Andy Whiteman knows about that before the Reformation, we had some 300 and something grammar schools across Scotland, many of which were famous in Europe. And where, and these, grammar schools, that means that these kids had already learned to read and write at dames' schools, which were all across Scotland. And then the boys could go on to these grammar schools, and many could then be sponsored to go on to universities and become the tutors to the nobility of Europe, and did so. Now, that was
colonization in action,
far ahead of John Knox. In the 1300s, we had the first compulsory education law. Those who could afford to send their sons to grammar school were required to do so by law in Scotland. It wasn't expensive, but for those who could not, there was the Common Good Fund, and the records of the grants that allowed these boys to go to school would make you cry. we had practically universal and free as needed education across Scotland
Before anybody else in Europe.
from the 1400s, early
It's
1400s.
mind-blowing. I mean, honestly, when you speak about this history and you paint a really good picture, it's so you literally have hundreds of years of history and you know, leading Europe, you know, leading thinking, leading all sorts, and then you get this Treaty of Union,
and
and
then
then
it all
it's
stopped.
like you said, it's like we just disappear for like 300 years.
The
If you
Dark
zoom
Ages.
back and go into the future, it's like I'm
Yeah.
sure at some point it's going to be looking like, well, firstly, it's a great tragedy. You know, you have all this time where Scotland is literally, you know, just been chopped off. And you could also think of like, well, what would have happened if the story would have been different? You can probably understand why England and the growth of capitalism and all the rest of it, you know, it just drowned that Scottish model, because the Scottish model was people participating in the government of their own country, and that just wouldn't be allowed. It's
So the principle, they couldn't under the stories I could tell you where, you know, English emissaries or ambassadors came up against, or even monarchs came up against the way Scots did things and could not get their heads around it, and then tried to make out we were the ones that had the top-down divine right of kings things. We didn't. It was computers that had that. But the reason I tell these stories is because of what I'm saying. It's not because I'm, you know, wedded to the past. Although, to quote John Galliano, you know, the past never says goodbye; it just says see you later. I am. It's not about being wedded to the past. It's about undoing the colonial mindset.
yeah.
It's about saying, look, guys, there is that which makes us Scots, and it isn't the accent or the dialect or the form of Scots or the Gaelic that we speak, and it isn't where we come from in Scotland, and it isn't whether we arrived, you know, whether our parents arrived here from Bangladesh or Ceylon or wherever, you know, or Ethiopia, wherever we've come from, or Hong Kong. We've got a constitution. It goes way back. It's something everybody can identify with and claim as theirs.
Reclaim, yeah.
That is the whole point of the sovereignty, is that this constitution that makes the people the final authority belongs to everybody equally, and it unites us when we have very little left of the old Scots identity to unite us. This does it, or it can if we want it to. It's really important to say stop flinching, guys, and I won't name them, at the notion that Scotland has a past that needs to be brought back to life, modernized. And most of all, you know, look at these things that are there to be proud of. Look at this history, because this history is a history of a constitutional development. The notion that everybody had a right to an education, I mean, my God, that at that time, you know,
yeah, that's revolutionary in the modern context. It's so revolutionary.
That's why we were famous for our education. That's the reason, you know.
Yeah.
The reason that we are still welcome across the world is because of these trade embassies, which, you know, I'll tell you about another time. Sorry, that's my late mother's bird clock that she belonged to the protection of our RSPB, and that was a clock she bought from them, and I've never had the heart to get rid of it. So it did. Anyway, so we come back to these historical illustrations to throw light on the Scotland that really existed, to try to get through this shame at our own past, which, as I said, is part of the cancer of colonization, which is intensely psychological, this internalized fiction about yourself, and embarrassment, the Scottish cringe. You know, that should not be there. But we have to break through that, and that's why restoring our real history matters, to break through that, to get people to understand, and then to show them what we have that we can unite around. But coming right back to where we started, in practical terms, the Scottish Constitution is a massive fortress defense against the corruption and the privilege and the insanity of the current feudal upper. It's the modern feudalism.
Yeah.
Those at the top, the current little elite. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Who can do who believe and are showing that they can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
They
In
can
fact, they seem to
control.
be speeding up things. We talk about across the pond, and as the First Amendment seems chucked away. Our protest laws and free speech. Yeah. I mean, things are really, really heating up. So this is an interesting time that Salvo's doing this. Maybe it's just the way it is. I mean, I'm sure you'd agree with me. Nobody can predict the future. What we're talking about here is just possibilities.
Yeah.
So if I hear, things, oh, that's never going to work in the real world or whatever, I just say, well, you don't know that for sure. It really depends on how the people view it and what they make of it. And the simple fact that it's a possibility, and the simple fact that we're talking facts here and historical facts, it's what you make it. I mean, I'm up here in the Highlands and stuff, and when I first came up here 20 odd years ago, Gaelic was dying apparently all around. But my 15-year-old soon, she speaks fluent Gaelic.
Great.
She has. And honestly, I work at a school where it started off with 60 and now there's 200.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that I don't know if it's a renaissance and stuff. And let's not even get into the Scottish government because they seem to give up when they get to secondary schools. But aside from that, I don't think it is dying at all. People in Scotland, even up here in the Highlands, they don't want to come up to a local area or a pub or club or something and just experience your ubiquitous, rubbish that you get. They actually like the culture. I mean, we like to go abroad probably because we like to see different cultures, not because we like to see all the same thing over and over again. So
Yeah. Well, Scots have
I'm
always been
hopeful.
very
I'm
international.
hopeful.
I think this reason for, I think we're at a tipping point. I think things have to go one way or the other. And so one of the things that drives me is that, I want a world for my grandson to grow up in that is better than the world I'm living in now. And I have to admit to being profoundly biased about my country, about Scotland. And I love meeting people from other countries who are profoundly biased in favor of theirs. And and I find that creates a sense of appreciation of what the other
Yeah,
has
and
to
it
offer.
doesn't mean we can't get on. We can.
Of course we can, and the whole point that you wouldn't need diversity appreciation if there were no diversity. So but I believe, biased as I may be, I truly believe that Scotland has the key. It actually has, or if you like, the cure. It has the cure to the cancer that is destroying the planet and the lives of people and animals and ecosystems that we're living on.
I
And
couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I listen. I better leave you, and you can get off.
yeah,
I'm sure you've got a lot to do. But
I do.
would you please come back? We could probably talk lots more. Yeah.
I probably waffled on a bit today, but
No, not at all. I like this kind of. I like this kind of informal stuff. And if people have spoken to me, they've not said anything negative. They seem to agree. So we'll just leave it at
no,
that.
it's been lovely and actually very relaxing and kind of G'd me up for what comes next, because it's all, the rest of today is all getting ready for this conference and these announcements and press releases and
Oh, brilliant.
constitutional stuff and.
Well, listen, Sarah, thank you so much. Honestly, so much appreciate you coming on, and I'm sure my viewers will appreciate it. And we wish you all the best with your
Thank you.
hard work. I know how much, I can only guess at the amount of hard work you do. It's like when I speak to Colette, like with the Freeports and stuff. She's all that group is a powerhouse too, and trying to warn everybody. And I know everybody has a hard time these days, but Freeports and this, what would you call it? You would call it a clear and present danger. I mean,
Yes,
they're going to hollow out communities and stuff. And even before we get independence, we probably need to deal with these.
we need to deal with it now,
Immediate.
and actually
Yeah.
part of liberation includes choosing a really important challenge and going for that. And that's, I think, I've thought really for the last couple of years that has to be where we bring the legal challenge. So, this is just one more thing, but we'll be
Okay.
looking at that in due course.
No worries. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, Sarah, and we look forward to seeing you again when you've got the time. We
Thank
much
you.
appreciate it.
Take care. Thanks so much. Bye.
No worries. Thank you, Sarah.